When my friend Kostya first told me that he was going to take guardianship of a little girl from a children's home, I thought he wouldn't manage, that he would break under the weight of responsibility and unpredictability. He was the type of person who could repair his house for an entire month for the sake of an idea, spend weekends volunteering at the local school, and then joke that everything in life was just trying something on. But this was not a trial run, not a hobby, not a rehabilitation project. This was a challenge sealed with the stamp of a court order, something that would fundamentally reshape his existence and pull me, without warning, into a world I never expected to inhabit. Vika, the girl was not yet 7 years old, had never heard sounds since birth. Complete deafness, as stated in her medical file in tedious bureaucratic language, words like profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss that seemed to strip away her humanity and replace it with a clinical diagnosis. Beyond her corner in the orphanage with its yellowed ceilings and identical beds, she owned nothing else. No family, no history, only a number in the registry and temporary guardians who changed every year like the seasons, each one staying just long enough to teach her that attachment was dangerous and that people always left. Kostya first met her on a volunteer day at the orphanage, a Saturday afternoon when the sunlight came through tall windows in geometric patterns, and the children seemed to exist in their own private worlds, separated from the rest of humanity by invisible barriers. She sat in the corner of a group, separated from the other children by the fact that they jumped and screamed while she stared into space, as if counting figures in the patterns of the parquet floor, as if there was a message written in the wood grain that only she could read. He approached her slowly, deliberately, showing her a simple gesture, just waved his hand. Vika didn't respond with the gesture, but she looked at his face with such intensity, as if trying to read him the way a shore tries to read a wave that is about to sweep it away, searching for meaning in the foam and the crash and the retreat. It wasn't love at first sight, he told me later, his voice carrying that particular thickness that comes when a person is trying to describe something that has no words for it. It was recognition, recognition that I was looking at a person who was no less complete than I was, but her completeness was hidden behind a wall that no one had tried to break through. After that meeting, he began regularly visiting the orphanage, investing his Saturdays in a child that nobody wanted, bringing toys that the other children would snatch away, bringing plasticine that she would mold into abstract shapes that meant nothing to anyone but her. He drew her portraits on large sheets of paper, trying to capture her expression, trying to understand through art what communication couldn't express. The documents took months to process, a bureaucratic marathon that seemed designed to test Kostya's commitment at every possible turn. Consultations with psychologists who asked him probing questions about his childhood, his relationships, his mental stability, as if being single and choosing to adopt a deaf girl somehow required psychological justification, checks of his living conditions, his income, his background, endless questions about motivation. Why do you want to adopt or take guardianship? Do you understand the challenges? Are you prepared for a lifetime commitment? When Kostya answered honestly, because she is nobody and she is a person, it was clear that the guardianship authorities expected something more from him, something more philosophical, more prepared, something that fit neatly into their checkboxes and evaluation forms. In a world where children are development projects or family name inheritance, the answer, she is a person, sounded almost heretical, almost dangerous. I helped him gather paperwork, drove him to consultations, listened to his late night monologues about doubts when his voice would crack and he would question whether he was being selfish or noble, whether he could actually do this or whether he was fooling himself. He was afraid not so much that he wouldn't be able to raise her, but that he would break her with his own uncertainty, that his doubts would become her wounds, that she would sense his fear and it would confirm what she already believed, that she was too much, too damaged, too broken to be loved by anyone. When little Vika stepped across the threshold of his apartment on an ordinary November day, with a thin backpack that contained everything she owned in the world, a coat that was too big for her because it had been donated to the orphanage, and eyes in which hope and fear mixed with learned caution, the caution of a child who had learned not to expect anything, it became clear that neither he nor I nor anyone we knew understood where to start or how to build this invisible bridge between the worlds of sound and silence. The apartment, which had seemed so large and empty before her arrival, suddenly felt too small, and every sound we made, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the breath between words, felt like violence. She cried the first night, a long and terrible crying that lasted for hours. Silently, without sound. It was strange and frightening because crying without sound seemed like deeper pain, more final, more absolute than any sob. Kostya sat by her bed and simply was there, not trying to comfort her, not using habitual words that meant nothing in her world. He simply breathed in the same rhythm as she did, matching his heartbeat to hers, letting her know through the most ancient language of all that loneliness had ended. At least for this night, at least while he was here. The most difficult part was not the documents, not the kitchen advice from familiar aunts who said love is what matters, or children feel everything with their hearts, well meaning platitudes that collapsed under the weight of reality. The most difficult was the silence. Precise, resilient, viscous silence that didn't reach toward you or away from you, that simply existed as a permanent state of being. Silence that freezes between adults when you don't know whether to embrace or leave, to ask or wait, when every gesture feels inadequate and every word feels like an intrusion. Kostya bought his first textbook on the sign language of the Russian deaf community, a thick volume written by specialists, filled with diagrams and photographs of hands in impossible positions. It lay on the kitchen counter between the salt shaker and the teapot, and at first it seemed simply funny to see it there. In the middle of ordinary life, like an IKEA instruction manual, but for a person, a how to guide for loving someone in a language that had nothing to do with sound. I downloaded an app on my phone that showed gestures slowly, syllable by syllable, as if I were an idiot incapable of grasping the meaning of rapid finger movements, each gesture breaking down into component parts like some mathematical equation. Kostya wrote out the most basic words on sticky notes around the apartment, creating a visual map of survival: water on the kitchen cabinet, food on the refrigerator, rest on the bedroom door, street on the entryway, thank you on the mirror, please on the living room wall, hurts on the bathroom door, good on the window. On the refrigerator, he stuck a chart of the sign language alphabet, a reference point, a rescue raft for those moments when communication felt impossible. Vika watched these attempts at communication with an expression of complete distrust, the wary eye of a child who had seen too many adults make promises they didn't keep, too many people try and fail and leave. She was already used to adults making sounds around her while ignoring her at the same time, talking to each other about her as if she wasn't there, using her disability as an explanation for their inability to connect with her. Now these same adults were showing her gestures that sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, and it seemed to her either mockery or another form of being ignored. Another way of saying, you don't belong here, but we're trying anyway. The first attempts were comically painful, moments of profound embarrassment and misunderstanding that somehow brought us closer together. I show the gesture for tea, because this was one of the first gestures I learned, because I live on tea, because coffee felt like a betrayal of my identity, but mixing up the finger position, misremembering the exact angle of the wrist, I accidentally make the gesture for rhinoceros. Vika looks at my hands, then at my face, then starts laughing soundlessly, but so hard that her entire small figure shakes with laughter, a laughter that is pure and unfiltered, and more real than any sound could be. It was the first time I saw her laugh, and it changed something in me that I can't quite explain. Kostya shows dog, but his finger order gets mixed up, his hands betraying him in the moment, and instead of an animal, out comes a crude curse word from the Russian Sign Language dictionary. I don't immediately understand what happened, but Vika blushes and nods her head, like, yes, that's exactly what I meant. That's the secret word I've been waiting to learn. Kostya, who was usually shy about his mistakes, laughs with us, and the tension that had been hanging in the air for weeks slightly lifts, like a weight being removed from our shoulders. We both signed up for evening classes in sign language taught by a woman named Irina, herself deaf since childhood, so she taught not like a foreign language, but as a natural means of communication, a living, breathing language with all its beauty and complexity and subtle nuances. I came to the first class skeptically, filled with doubt and resistance. What was I going to do in a group where everyone else was already gesturing rapidly at each other, giving each other high fives and moving their fingers in patterns I couldn't follow? Irina approached me directly and said to my face, because deaf people often look directly at your face, it's part of their language, a form of respect and connection. You're not here because it's fashionable. You're not here because it's trendy or because you want to seem enlightened. You're here because you need someone. That's good. Let's begin. Evening after evening, we built phrases, made mistakes, corrected ourselves, learned that language is not a perfect thing, but a process of constant negotiation and adjustment. Kostya, who was somewhat shy at home, became differently attentive here. He looked not just at hands, but at shoulders, at head turns, at the way Irina raised her eyebrows to give meaning to a gesture, At the tilt of her head that changed everything about what her hands were saying. She taught us sign language is not just hands, it's face, it's posture, it's the space around your body, it's breath, which becomes punctuation, which marks the moments between thoughts. It took me months to understand. Silence is not quiet at all. Silence is full of information, full of texture and depth and meaning. Silence is the canvas on which everything else is painted. At home, we applied what we learned, implementing our new understanding into the daily rhythms of our lives. Kostya lowered his voice, not because it was the right answer, not because someone told him to, but because in silence, clarity comes earlier, honesty arrives sooner, and the space between people becomes more precious. I noticed how his posture changed when he communicated with Vika. He sat lower, at eye level with her, didn't overshadow the space with his adult presence. And Vika changed, slowly, carefully, imperceptibly at first. But she changed. She began initiating contact, showing gestures not just in response to requests, but on her own initiative, taking risks, reaching out into the space between us. There were days when it didn't work, days when all our efforts seemed to dissolve into nothing. There were days when Vika turned away, went to the corner, and sat there for hours, hugging her knees, and we didn't know if she was sick, hurt, or just tired of these adults trying to speak to her in a strange language that still felt foreign in her mouth and mind. On those days, Kostya looked broken, his face carrying the weight of every failure, every moment he felt he had let her down. I saw him lying on the couch thinking he had failed, that she would never love him, that her trauma was deeper than he could reach, that the ocean between them was too wide to cross. But then came a scene I remember with perfect clarity, a moment that crystallized something essential about what we were doing. We were in a store, Kostya, Vika, and I, moving through the aisles with the ordinary purpose of buying groceries. A random person, a young woman in line ahead of us, said loudly to Kostya, her voice cutting through the store like a knife, "Maybe you could teach her to speak properly? It's not very nice to go through an entire store in silence." The words hung in the air like poison, like an accusation, like a judgment passed and sealed. I felt something break inside me, felt anger rising up from a place I didn't know existed. But Kostya just looked at her and asked, his voice steady and clear, "Or maybe you could learn to look. It's not very nice not to see a person standing in front of you." The woman's face flushed red, and she turned away, and the store seemed to stop for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. Vika didn't hear a word, but she saw our faces, saw the intensity in Kostya's expression, saw how he took her hand, then mine, and she showed the gesture we had recently learned. People are stupid. We both laughed, a deep and genuine laugh that felt like release, like triumph, like love. The first small victories were almost invisible to others, but for us they had the significance of transcendent events, moments when we felt that we were actually accomplishing something, actually making a difference. One day, Vika showed a complete phrase for the first time. "I want water." Not just a finger pointing at a cup like before, not just the desperate pantomime of need, but a full sentence gesture with subject, I, object, water, and action, want. It lasted 2 seconds. But for Kostya, it was the same as other people hearing their child's first word. That miraculous moment when the child becomes a person, capable of expressing their own will. Then came the day when she drew a sun on the floor by the door with chalk, a simple yellow circle with rays extending outward like hope. Kostya asked me to help figure out what it meant, and I suggested it was just a drawing. Maybe she wanted to draw. Maybe it was nothing but simple childhood art. But then Kostya showed her the gesture for sun and the gesture for good, and she nodded enthusiastically. She was showing us that today was nice weather and we needed to go for a walk, that she understood the connection between the symbol and the reality, that she could communicate her desires and expectations. Then, and it was almost impossible to wait for, came the day when she hit her hand on the corner of a cupboard, and I watched her face register the pain. Quickly and almost without fear, she showed the gesture for hurts, and that became much, much more important than all the other victories combined, because pain is the reverse side of trust. When a person tells you they hurt, they're saying, "I believe you'll want to help. I trust you with my vulnerability. I believe you won't abandon me in my suffering." Vika would come to Kostya and show him where it hurt and wait for his help, his touch, his presence. This wasn't just a communication skill. This was recognition. This was faith. This was love. Along with learning sign language, we learned about each other, learned new aspects of ourselves that we didn't know existed. Kostya started waking up earlier to greet Vaika with a morning gesture. He showed the sun, pointing at the window, then showed her, pointing at her, then good, smiling. Good morning, Vaika. I'm happy to see you today, the gesture said, a daily reaffirmation of belonging. I noticed how she started expecting this gesture, waking up with the feeling that she was expected, that her presence mattered, that someone was thinking about her before the day even began. I learned to distinguish between her silence and her not understanding. When she didn't understand a gesture, her face became concentrated, as if she were listening intently with her eyes, her entire body focused on the effort of comprehension. When she just wanted to be alone, she would turn away but not leave, meaning it was not detachment but a need for space, a boundary that we had to learn to respect. Gradually, I understood that silence is not emptiness. Silence is different voices, different forms of expression, different ways of being present in the world. The three of us began developing something like a personal language, something that belonged only to us. Not quite sign language, not quite regular speech, but something in between, something that grew out of our specific relationship and our specific needs. Kostya invented a special gesture for our apartment, not the official sign for home, but something personal, something that meant specifically our home, our place, our sanctuary. I showed her the gesture for friend, which I had learned in class, and she added something to it, repeating my gesture, but then placing her hand over her heart. A friend who is close to the heart, a friend who matters, a friend who is worth the effort. At one of the classes, Irina said to us, "You are learning a language, but you are learning yourselves. Every gesture you make is a risk. You risk being misunderstood, looking foolish, missing the meaning, but you do it, and that means you are ready to change." I didn't fully understand what she meant then, but later, when the three of us were sitting in a coffee shop and I showed the barista the gesture for cappuccino, I felt that I had indeed changed. I was no longer just a person rushing through life with sounds. I became a person who listens to silence, who sees beyond the surface, who understands that communication is about presence and effort and genuine attention. The real test came not from Vaika, but from the outside world. And it was harder and more vicious than anything we had faced before. And the outside world turned out to be far less ready than I expected, far less willing to accept difference, far more hostile to anything that didn't fit the narrow definition of normal that society had created. The first walk down a crowded street was like a mission into unexplored and dangerous territory, a test of our commitment and our courage. At the market, a vendor started shouting at Vaika, not waiting for an answer to his question, as if the volume of sound could somehow overcome her deafness, as if loudness could compensate for the fundamental communication barrier. Kostya calmly explained that she couldn't hear and showed the vendor sign gestures for numbers, but the vendor just shrugged and turned away, his dismissal complete and total. The message was clear: that's your problem, not mine, and I don't have time or patience for this difficulty. On the neighboring staircase, a woman from the adjacent building said loudly to Kostya, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why do you need such a burden? Don't you feel sorry for yourself?" The words landed like a blow, like a judgment, like a condemnation not just of his choice, but of his character, his sanity, his worth as a person. I was there. I saw Kostya straighten, saw his hands clench into fists, saw the anger and pain and helplessness wash over his face. Then I saw him take Vaika's hand and simply walk past, choosing dignity over response, choosing to protect her from the ugliness of the world. But later, when we got home, he locked himself in the bathroom for 20 minutes, and I heard him crying, a deep and anguished cry that spoke of all the doubt and fear and sadness he had been holding in. The neighbors whispered on the stairs, their voices forming a chorus of judgment and concern and fascination with the difficult and unusual thing that had entered their building. I caught fragments. Some strange girl. Where did she come from? Should report it to the police. As if taking guardianship of a child was a crime, as if love was something suspicious and dangerous. The old lady from the next building asked Kostya directly, "Why do you need such a burden? You're young, you could have a normal child." The word normal hung in the air like a curse, like a definition of worth, like a statement about what was acceptable and what was not. I saw Kostya close his eyes and try to remember my phrase from those nights when he doubted, "She is a person." We both felt shame then, for the first time, truly for the first time. Not shame for Vaika, but shame for those looks, for those words, for a world that seems designed for a certain image of a person and is ready to simply throw everyone else off the edge. Her silence seemed suddenly purer. Her muteness seemed more right than their sounds, their judgments, their cruelty, wrapped in the package of concern. But instead of isolating Vika from the world, building a wall of protection around her, we decided to do something different, something that would require more courage and vulnerability than hiding ever could. We decided to teach the world to see her correctly, to show people that difference is not damage, that silence is not emptiness, that a child without hearing is no less valuable, no less worthy, no less human than any other child. Kostya enrolled Vika in a theater studio for children with special needs, not because he wanted to make her an actress, not because he was trying to fix her or cure her or make her normal, but because we needed a stage where silence had the right to be beautiful, where her natural form of expression was the vehicle for art rather than an obstacle to overcome. At the first class, the teacher asked Kostya if she could hear anything at all, and I watched his jaw tighten as he prepared to have this conversation again, to explain again, to defend his daughter again. Kostya answered, "She can't, but she sees better than people who listen." The teacher nodded, as if this was obvious, and I felt something shift, felt hope kindle in my chest. They prepared a show adapted for all types of communication, a story that didn't rely on sound to convey meaning. It was a story about how a tree tries to become a different tree, a metaphor for acceptance and identity and the courage to be yourself. Funny, touching, told entirely through body, face, and gestures. Each child expressed their role through the plasticity of hands, the turn of their torso, their facial expression, their entire being focused on communication through movement and presence. Vika played a small bush that was initially sad because everyone else was tall, but then understood that growing low was also normal and started rejoicing in the sun, finding happiness in her own nature rather than in comparison to others. I came to every rehearsal, making it a non negotiable part of my schedule. This became my new sacred rhythm. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Not work, not meetings with friends, but rehearsals, the place where Vika was building her identity and learning to express herself. I learned alongside her, did homework with her, which, by the way, had also been reformatted into gestures and drawings, into a visual language that made sense in her world. I taught her stories and jokes in sign language, though I wasn't a master of it, and often she laughed more at my incorrect gestures than at the story itself, finding joy in my stumbling attempts to communicate with her. The most valuable thing we understood in the process was that silence also teaches, that what is not said is sometimes more important than what is, that the space between words is where understanding grows. At some point, I noticed that Kostya and I were using regular voice less and less, not only when talking to Vika, but also with each other. We began speaking in gestures even when she wasn't around, when it was just the two of us, building a shared language that belonged to all three of us. And strangely, but the world in those moments seemed more honest, more direct, more intimate somehow. In sign language, it's hard to lie because your face always gives away the truth, because you can't hide behind words or tone of voice, because everything you feel is written on your body for the world to see. The climax, when it came, arrived unexpectedly and with double force, shattering our small private world and scattering it into the larger world beyond. The school that Vika was going to attend organized a parent meeting for new families, and Kostya didn't want to go. He was afraid of hearing the same things from neighbors, from shopkeepers, from random people in the tram, afraid that this would be another place where he would have to defend his choice, explain his daughter, justify her existence. But I told him, if we don't go, she'll walk into that class and they'll see only a not quite normal child. Not her parent, not the man who chose her, not the love that brought her here. He agreed, and we went together, Kostya nervous and me trying to project confidence I didn't feel. There were about 25 people at the meeting, parents of other children, people whose lives seemed uncomplicated, and whose children fit neatly into society's expectations. The school principal talked about the program, requirements, donations, the practical details of education. Then she mentioned that this year they were accepting a child with special needs, and I felt the energy in the room shift, felt attention focus. Several parents glanced around, trying to figure out who the problem would be. I felt Kostya tense beside me, felt him bracing for judgment. The principal said there would be a sign language specialist in the class, and that all children would learn the basics of signing. This is good, she said, because everyone learns from each other. And I heard the wisdom in those words, the understanding that diversity was not a problem to be solved, but an opportunity for growth. After the meeting ended, several parents approached Kostya, and I held my breath, waiting for the criticism, the judgment, the veiled or not so veiled expression of disapproval. The first was a young mother with a small son who was innately receptive to others' suffering, who understood instinctively that difference was not something to fear. She asked, how can she teach her children to communicate with Vika? What gestures are most important? Can her son help? Kostya, who was prepared for resistance, got questions and curiosity instead, and I watched his face transform, watched the tension drain from his shoulders. He spent half an hour telling everyone interested about how sign language works, showing the most basic gestures, sharing his knowledge with a generosity that came from relief and gratitude and joy. Another mother, who before seemed critically inclined, asked if she could sign up for sign language courses. Another father said this was a good reminder to his children that not all people are organized the same way, and that was normal. That difference was a natural part of human existence. But the most important thing happened when one of the mothers, a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a gentle demeanor, approached Kostya and said, I'm going to apply for adoption of a deaf child from an orphanage after hearing what you told us about Vika. Kostya didn't know what to say, was rendered speechless by this declaration, by this evidence that his choice mattered, that his love was contagious, that his willingness to embrace difference was changing the world in ways he couldn't measure. He just looked at her face for a long time, and then she smiled and said, thank you for not hiding her. Thank you for showing that it's normal, that it's possible, that it's worth doing. That evening I hugged Kostya and said, this was the beginning. He answered, the beginning of what? And I said, the beginning of the world getting bigger, the beginning of understanding that we are not alone in this, that what we are doing matters. After the meeting, a chain reaction occurred that no one had planned, a cascade of consequences that rippled outward in ways we couldn't anticipate. A neighbor got involved in the project of dubbing cartoons with subtitles, not officially, just for fun and for his people, the community of deaf children and adults who had been underserved by entertainment for too long. Then it became a real project, something meaningful and purposeful, and several other people joined. And within half a year, 70 cartoons had been dubbed and subtitled, bringing stories and laughter to children who had been excluded from the joy of animation. I helped distribute them on social media, watching as the project spread, as more people became involved, as the world slowly, incrementally began to change. Vika watched them joyfully because she could understand the cartoon characters through gestures and facial expressions, through the universal language of emotion and movement and storytelling. Irina, our sign language teacher, invited us to a conference on inclusion, and Kostya gave a short presentation about how learning sign language brings people together, about how the act of communication is fundamentally an act of love. I remember him standing on stage telling about the first day when Vika slept in his apartment, about the market and the dismissive vendor, about the neighbor who called her a burden, about gestures in the store and the young woman who was moved to adopt because of what she heard. He told about the show, about the school meeting, about watching his daughter perform and knowing that she had found her voice, her way of expressing herself to the world. And at the end, he said, this is not a story about heroism. This is a story about the fact that when we learn something, we don't just learn a language, we experience something fundamental about ourselves and our place in the world. And when we truly allow ourselves to be changed by another person, we become better. In the audience, there were several people who later came up with their own stories, their own experiences of transformation. One woman said her school-age daughter was now learning sign language at school, and it helped her understand that there are people who communicate differently, that diversity was not an aberration, but a beautiful and necessary part of human existence. A young man said that after hearing about Vika through our story, which somehow spread on the internet, finding its way into the consciousness of people we would never meet, he decided to help organize a sports school for deaf children, a place where they could be athletes, could be strong, could be seen. Vika's story was no longer just our path, not just the journey of 3 people through silence. It had moved into neighboring families, into schools, into orphanages, into the homes of people we would never meet, changing lives in ways we would never know, creating possibilities that extended far beyond what any of us could have imagined. We celebrated the first anniversary of her guardianship with a small dinner. Nothing fancy, just the 3 of us and the life we had built together. Vika drew a card for Kostya, using colored pencils and careful deliberation. On it were 3 people holding hands, rendered in her child's hand with all the love and intention she could pour into the image. At the top, she wrote the letter V, then drew the gesture for thank you right on the paper as a drawing, her way of expressing gratitude for the choice he made, for the love he offered, for the family he created. Kostya cried looking at that card, tears streaming down his face, but these were not tears of sadness. These were tears of fullness, of feeling that life didn't just happen, but that you had chosen it, that you had made decisions that mattered, that the love you gave was returned in abundance. School turned out to be easier than we feared, a place where Vika could flourish and grow and become herself. Children are beings who haven't yet fully learned prejudice, so they looked at Vika not as a problem, but as a mystery, something interesting and different and worth exploring. They drew, invented gestures, tried to repeat what she showed them, learning her language as enthusiastically as she was learning theirs. Vika was not the class outcast, but its little star, because she was different, and different is interesting, different is beautiful, different teaches us about ourselves and about the world. The music teacher, when she learned that Vika couldn't hear, didn't panic or think that she needed to be excluded from class. Instead, she taught the class to feel rhythm through vibration, through the feeling of drums, through movement that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to the body and the soul. Vika felt music through the floors, through tables, through air that shook from sound. And for her, it was magic, it was revelation, it was proof that she could participate fully in the world, even without the sense that society considered most important. She began to dance, and through dancing, she discovered a voice that had never needed sound, an expression that reached people in ways that words never could. I remember the first time I went to a concert where Vika performed, watching her move across the stage with a grace that surprised everyone who knew her only in her silent, careful, everyday life. She and five other children danced to classical music, moving together in a performance that was both unified and individual. Vika didn't dance in time because time was fundamentally inaccessible to her, but she danced beautifully, with feeling, with an understanding of what was happening around her that came from her own internal rhythm. Her movements were honest, unpretentious, purely herself, and in that moment I understood that the world didn't need her to be different, didn't need her to be like everyone else. The world needed her exactly as she was, complete and whole and perfect in her own unique way. Kostya regularly took her to activities I had recommended, building a life that was rich and varied and full of possibility. Swimming, which she loved because water is also a form of communication, because the body moves differently in water, because there is freedom in weightlessness. Drawing, because paint doesn't require sound, because art is a language that belongs to everyone. Computer games, because a computer communicates through images and gestures, not through sounds, because the digital world had adapted to include people like her. But the most important thing happened when she met another deaf girl at school. A moment that crystallized for me the difference between isolation and community. Her name was Masha, and she was 2 years older than Vika, already comfortable in her own skin, already confident in her place in the world. And when these two girls met, something magical happened, something that I had not anticipated, but that felt inevitable in retrospect. They spoke to each other in sign language, and it was the fastest, most beautiful, most natural language I had ever witnessed. Not a language that was questioned, not a language that needed to be explained to adults, not a second rate form of communication used in the absence of the real thing. Just two people speaking their own way, communicating with a fluency and naturalness that made me realize that what Kostya and I had been learning was not a special accommodation, but a legitimate language with all the complexity and beauty and nuance of any language in the world. Masha taught Vika new gestures, faster and more expressive than the ones Kostya and I had painstakingly taught her, opening her eyes to the full richness of sign language. She showed her how to live in a world that isn't always ready to see her, but where there are people who do see her, who understand her, who speak her language. 2 years later, there was a birthday celebration for Vika at school, a recognition of her as a valued member of the school community. Children congratulated her with gestures, showed drawings they had made, expressing their affection in her language. Teachers told how Vika had helped their class change, become more attentive to diversity, more willing to see people who were different as valuable and important members of society rather than problems to be solved. But then something strange happened, something that challenged everything Kostya had built. Kostya's ex-wife, his mother, a woman who had left him many years ago, approached him. She's not fully part of our story, but she was a harsh fact that hung over Kostya like a cloud, a reminder of abandonment and pain and the difficulty of commitment. She looked at Vika, then at Kostya, and said something I didn't quite hear, something quiet and private. But later Kostya told me. She said that I seemed to have found a way to be a good father, and she's happy for Vika, that she was proud of what I had done. It was an attempt at reconciliation, an attempt to acknowledge that perhaps Kostya had become someone better, someone more capable of love and commitment than he had been when they were together. Kostya answered her carefully. Maybe, but this is not your space. This is Vika's space. Be kind to her, and that will be enough for me. He was setting boundaries, protecting his daughter, ensuring that reconciliation would not come at the cost of Vika's well being or his own hard won peace. What I learned that day was that love doesn't always mean forgiveness, that sometimes love just means I will protect what I chose to protect, that I will not let the past interfere with the future, that I will prioritize the present and the people who matter most to me over settling old scores or healing old wounds. In the third year, Vika was no longer just the girl Kostya took guardianship of. She was a person, complete and complex, with her own fantasies and dreams, her own angers and joys, her own sense of humor, and her own pain. She was moody, like all children, but her moods were honest because they weren't muddied by the sounds we use to hide our real feelings, the social masks and polite fictions that hearing people develop to navigate the world. One day she showed us a gesture we didn't know, a gesture that didn't appear in any of our textbooks or apps, a gesture that was uniquely hers. We showed it to Irina, and she said it was an invented gesture that Vika herself had created to describe a feeling that has no name in sign language, a feeling that is specifically hers, specifically this moment in time. It was a gesture that meant, I am lonely, but not very, because I know there are people trying to understand me, because I know I am not alone. Kostya started taking her to deaf children's camp in summer, a place where she could be among her own people, where she didn't have to explain herself or adapt or conform to the hearing world's expectations. There she met other children like her, other people who communicated like her, who shared her experience of navigating a world not built for them. There she wasn't a little star because she was different. There she was just a person among people, which was perhaps the greatest gift of all. I saw how she came back from camp different, more confident, more peaceful, more rooted in her own identity and her own worth. She knew that her language was not a deficit, but a choice of countless people, that she was not alone in her silence, but surrounded by a community of people who understood her, who spoke her language, who valued her exactly as she was. This is a story about a miracle, but not about the kind of miracle that happens suddenly, like thunder from the sky. This is a story about a miracle that is built day by day, gesture by gesture, smile by smile, moment by moment, through the persistent and deliberate choice to love someone even when the world says it's too hard, even when the path forward is unclear, even when doubt whispers that you're not enough. This is a story about my friend who decided to see a person where the world saw only a problem, only a burden, only something broken and discarded, and about how that choice changed not just the life of one girl, but the lives of many people, including his own, including mine.